Damaris arrives in the fog-brushed village of Marrow-on-the-Hill, hoping to escape the phantom noise of her city life. Surrounded by the rhythmic chime of clocks and the warmth of new acquaintances, she struggles to trade her lifelong crisis-driven pace for a slower pulse. Follow her gentle path toward stillness as she discovers if her heart can finally find a sense of peace. The weight of echoes. The bus door hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a surgical clamp, leaving Damaris Okoro alone on the gravel shoulder of Marrow-on-the-Hill. A thick, damp fog had settled over the valley, clinging to her wool coat and blurring the edges of the world into a smudge of charcoal and slate. For a moment she simply stood there, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, while the ringing in her ears persisted, a phantom choir of sirens and the high-pitched whine of ventilators that had followed her from the city. It was a psychic residue, a layer of noise that refused to peel away just because the scenery had changed. She closed her eyes and attempted the box-breathing technique she had taught a dozen interns over the years. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. But as she drew the salt-heavy air into her lungs, her chest tightened. The air felt too thick, almost viscous, as if the fog were trying to fill her lungs with something other than oxygen. A phantom urgency clawed at the back of her throat, the ingrained instinct that a code was being called somewhere, that a patient was crashing in a room she couldn't see, and that every second she spent standing still was a second of negligence. She exhaled a long, conscious breath, but it sounded thin and brittle against the oppressive hush of the hillside. Damaris gripped the handle of her suitcase, the leather digging into her palm, and began the walk toward the rental cottage. Her pace was instinctively fast, her strides long and predatory. She didn't walk so much as she patrolled the perimeter of the quiet street, her eyes scanning the gray facades of the stone cottages for any sign of distress. She looked for the flicker of a curtain, a misplaced trash bin, or a stray dog, anything that signaled a breach in the order of things. The silence of Marrow-on-the-Hill wasn't a void. It was a presence, a heavy blanket that seemed to push against her skin, demanding a surrender she wasn't yet capable of giving. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing bird call sliced through the mist. The sound was abrupt, a jagged edge of noise that ripped through the stillness. Damaris jolted, her body snapping into a defensive crisis mode stance. Her shoulders hiked toward her ears, her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, and her hands flew up in a reflexive shielding motion. Her heart didn't just beat. It hammered against her ribs with a violent, erratic rhythm, the same cadence she felt during a massive hemorrhage in the ore. She stood frozen for several seconds, her breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at a small, unremarkable crow perched on a mossy fence post. The bird tilted its head, watching her with a black, unblinking eye, seemingly amused by the sudden rigidity of the woman in the gray coat. By the time she reached the cottage, the adrenaline had left a bitter, metal-sharp taste in her mouth. The house was a small, salt-bleached structure with a slate roof and a heavy oak door that groaned on its hinges. Inside, the silence was even more profound, a vacuum that seemed to suck the air from the room. Damaris dropped her suitcase in the hallway and immediately reached for her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling through old emails and archived threads from the surgical ward. She checked for notifications that no longer mattered, looking for the digital tether that kept her bound to the chaos. There were no new alerts, no urgent pages, only the sterile glow of the screen reflecting in her tired eyes. The lack of noise felt like a different kind of alarm, a warning that she was now entirely alone with the noise inside her own head. She moved to the bedroom to unpack, but the simple task became an exercise in frustration. As she reached for a stack of folded linens, her hands began to shake, a fine, rhythmic tremor that started in the fingertips and radiated up to her elbows. It wasn't the shake of cold or hunger, but the physical manifestation of a burnout that had moved past exhaustion and into the marrow of her bones. She tried to grip the edge of the dresser to steady herself, but her fingers felt clumsy as if they belonged to someone else. She watched her own hand, the skin pale and the veins prominent, and felt a surge of alienation. She had spent 15 years using these hands to save lives, to suture arteries and stabilize fractures, yet she couldn't seem to make them hold a piece of clothing still. Damaris retreated to the window, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the fog had intensified, swallowing the cobblestones and erasing the boundary between the earth and the sky. She watched a single street lamp flicker, its yellow light struggling to penetrate the haze. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a stranger inhabiting a body that had forgotten how to be still. The city had taught her that stillness was death, that a silence was a failure, and now that she had finally found the quiet she had craved, it felt like a weight pressing her down into the floorboards. She wondered if the burnout was a wound that could actually heal, or if she had simply traded one kind of noise for another. Then, through the damp air, a sound arrived. It wasn't the jarring scream of a siren or the insistent chirp of a pager. It was a distant, low-frequency chime, a deep resonance that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the ground itself. It was a heavy, rhythmic pulse, slow and deliberate, vibrating in her sternum like a second heartbeat. The sound didn't demand her attention, it invited it. It was a sonic anchor, a steady beat that cut through the fog and the tremor in her hands. Damaris closed her eyes, letting the vibration wash over her, and for the first time since she had stepped off the bus, the phantom urgency in her chest eased. She didn't know where the sound was coming from, but as the chime faded into a long, humming echo, she felt a strange magnetic pull toward the center of town, as if the clock were calling her home to a place she had never been. The cobalt fog. The cobblestones of Marrow-on-the-Hill were slick with a moisture that felt less like rain and more like a condensation of the air itself. Damaris moved through the cobalt haze, her boots clicking in a rhythm that felt too fast for the silence surrounding her. She was chasing the chime, that deep, subterranean pulse that had settled the tremor in her hands, but the fog had a way of swallowing distance. The world had shrunk to a 10-foot radius of pale blue light and the scent of damp stone. She stepped forward, her gaze drifting toward the blurred outlines of the eaves above, and nearly collided with a woman who seemed to have materialized from the mist like a statue. The woman was crouched on the narrow sidewalk, her movements precise and economical. She held a heavy terracotta pot, shifting it by a fraction of an inch until it aligned perfectly with three others. Her apron was a stark, bleached white, devoid of a single smudge or stray thread. She didn't jump at Damaris's sudden arrival. She simply paused, her hand still resting on the rim of the pot, and looked up. Her eyes were sharp, scanning Damaris with a clinical detachment that felt uncomfortably familiar. It was the look of a surgeon assessing a wound, or a clerk auditing a ledger. Damaris stopped short, her breath coming in shallow, jagged bursts. She felt the old phantom urgency of the ward clawing at her throat, the instinct to check a monitor or verify a dosage. She shifted her weight, her fingers instinctively rubbing her temples in a slow, circular motion. The silence between them wasn't the soft kind. It was a vacuum that amplified the sound of Damaris's own erratic respiration. "You are breathing as if you were running a race," the woman said. Her voice was crisp, a series of clean cuts that left no room for ambiguity. She didn't stand up immediately, instead using a finger to ensure the pot was exactly perpendicular to the edge of the stone. "And your eyes are searching for a crisis. It is a very loud way to exist in a very quiet place." Damaris let out a long, conscious exhale, though it felt insufficient. "I'm sorry. I'm new here. I heard something. A sound. I'm still adjusting to the pace." The woman stood then, smoothing out an imaginary crease in her apron with a quick downward swipe of her palm. She was lean and held herself with a rigidity that suggested a spine made of iron. Adjusting is a matter of will, not time. What you carry is city-bred agitation. It is a habit of the mind, a refusal to let the internal noise settle. You treat the silence as a void to be filled rather than a space to inhabit. Damaris felt a flash of heat rise to her cheeks. She had spent 15 years in a metropolitan surgical unit where agitation was a survival mechanism, where a split second of hesitation could be the difference between a stable patient and a code blue. To have it dismissed as a lack of discipline felt like a critique of her very soul. "It isn't a habit," Damaris replied, her voice airy and hesitant. "It's exhaustion. There is a difference between being restless and being depleted." "Is there?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unmoved. "Many people mistake the inability to be still for fatigue. They believe that if they simply find a quiet room, the peace will arrive as a gift. But peace is not a gift, miss." "Damaris," she whispered. "Miss Damaris, peace is a practice. It is a muscle that must be trained. By bringing your chaos into Marrow-on-the-Hill, you are merely transporting your noise to a different coordinate. You are not resting, you are simply waiting for the next alarm to go off in your head." Damaris opened her mouth to argue, to explain the crushing weight of burnout and the way the city had hollowed her out, but the woman had already shifted her focus. She stepped closer, not to offer comfort, but to point toward a small, hand-painted sign bolted to a nearby lamppost. The lettering was exquisite, a series of perfect, looping, calligraphic strokes. "The rules of quietude," the woman stated. "We do not shout, we do not rush, we do not impose the frantic energy of the exterior world upon the interior peace of the town." I suggest you spend the afternoon observing the fog. Stop trying to reach a destination and simply exist where you are. Until you can walk without sounding like a ticking bomb, you will find very little solace here." Without another word, the woman returned to her pots, her focus snapping back to the alignment of the terracotta with a suddenness that left Damaris feeling intellectually adrift. She had been dismissed, not with anger, but with a terrifyingly polite efficiency. Damaris stood there for a moment, her hand still hovering near her temple, feeling the gap between her own frayed edges and this woman's seamless precision. She turned away, her boots feeling heavier now. She wandered deeper into the cobalt fog, letting the dampness cling to her skin. As she moved, the sharp edges of the encounter began to blur. The fog was thick, almost tactile, like a wet wool blanket wrapping around her shoulders. It muted the world, softening the harsh lines of the architecture and swallowing the distant sounds of the town. For the first time, Damaris stopped fighting the silence and let it press against her. She slowed her pace, consciously lengthening the gap between each step, watching the way the blue mist swirled around her ankles. As she rounded a corner, the scent hit her. It wasn't the brine of the sea or the dampness of the stone. It was a warm golden aroma, beeswax, old mahogany, and a hint of something metal sharp, like a metal tang coin held in a warm palm. The smell triggered a dormant memory, a sudden vivid image of her grandfather's study, the heavy oak desk, and the feeling of absolute safety that came from being surrounded by things that had lasted for 100 years. Her heart eased. The phantom urgency in her chest subsided, replaced by a magnetic pull. She followed the scent toward a storefront that seemed to be carved directly into the gray stone of the street. The window was clouded with age, but through the grime she could see the silhouettes of tall, slender shapes. Clocks of all sizes, their pendulums frozen or swinging in a slow, hypnotic unison. She reached the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. She wanted the warmth. She wanted the smell of beeswax to erase the memory of the woman in the white apron. But as she grasped the iron knob, she found it wouldn't budge. A heavy iron bolt had been slid into place from the inside, locking the world out. Damaris leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing her eyes. She could hear it now. The rhythmic, deep chime she had followed from the house, emanating from within the shop. It was a heartbeat, steady and patient, promising a stillness she didn't know how to claim. She stepped back and noticed a small, weathered wooden sign hanging from a rusted chain. In a neat, unassuming script it read, "Time is being mended." Damaris sighed, a sound that was almost a prayer. Just as she began to turn away, the bolt slid back with a heavy, metal-sharp clank. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a dim, amber-lit interior and a man with steady eyes and a pair of glasses perched precariously on his nose. "You're late," the man said, his voice low and resonant, like a metronome hitting a perfect beat. The Mahogany Sanctuary. The door swung open mid-creak, and a wall of sound hit Damaris that felt less like noise and more like a physical weight. It was a synchronized tide of ticking, hundreds of tiny, metal-sharp heartbeats breathing in a ragged but collective unison. The sound didn't clash, it layered, creating a dense humming fabric of time that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. She stepped over the threshold, her boots clicking softly on the dark floorboards, and felt the air shift from the cobalt dampness of the street to a dry, golden warmth that tasted of linseed oil and ancient dust. Her nurse's instinct flared immediately. Without thinking, she began to count. She tried to isolate a single tick, to find the cadence of one clock and lock onto it, the way she used to monitor a patient's erratic pulse during a midnight crash in the ICU. But the rhythms were too many, too varied. There were the frantic, thin skips of small travel clocks, and the slow, cavernous thrums of the great mahogany towers. Her mind, trained for years to categorize chaos into actionable data, spun out. The analytical machinery in her head whirred, searching for the source of the discord, until the sheer volume of the ticking overwhelmed her. For the first time in a decade, the noise was too much to organize, and the effort of trying to control it left her breathless. "You're late," the man repeated. He didn't move toward her, but his presence filled the gap in the doorway. He was lean, wearing a canvas apron stained with oil and graphite, with a pair of round glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. His voice was low and resonant, a steady bass note that acted as a grounding wire to the static humming in Damaris's head. He didn't sound accusing, he sounded as if he were simply stating a fact of nature, like the tide coming in or the sun dipping behind the hills. Damaris froze, her hand still clutching the strap of her bag. She watched him. really looked at him, past the apron and the glasses. The architecture of his face was familiar, a ghost from a childhood spent in the salt spray air of Marrow-on-the-Hill. The way he stood, with a slight tilt to his shoulders and a stillness in his core, triggered a memory of climbing apple trees and hiding in the tall grass of the moor. "Oisin?" she whispered. Her voice sounded thin, an airy rasp that barely carried over the ticking. Oisin Thorn didn't smile immediately, but his eyes softened. He reached up and adjusted his glasses with a single, precise finger, a gesture so specific it felt like a key turning in a lock. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the sanctuary of the shop. "I wondered when the city would finally spit you back out," he said. His cadence was metronomic, each word given its own space to breathe, devoid of the frantic urgency that had defined every conversation Damaris had had for the last 5 years. "You look like you've been fighting a war, Damaris, or at least a very long shift." Damaris didn't answer. She couldn't. She moved further into the room, her gaze drifting over the walls. Clocks of every imaginable shape draped the space. Brass regulators, ornate cuckoo clocks with carved alpine forests, and minimalist discs of slate. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of a heavy mahogany counter that ran the length of the center of the room. The wood was cool and polished to a mirror sheen, but as she pressed her palm flat against the surface, she felt a faint, rhythmic vibration. It was the collective pulse of the shop, a low-frequency thrum that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders dropped. The tension that had lived in the crook of her neck since she left the city began to unravel. She leaned her weight onto the counter, closing her eyes, letting the vibration do the work her own mind couldn't. The mahogany felt solid, an anchor in a world that had felt like shifting sand for far too long. Oisin watched her, his gaze clinical but kind. He didn't ask her why she was shaking or where she had been. He simply noted the city shadows in her eyes, that hollow, wide-eyed look of a person who had spent too many hours staring at monitors and counting seconds in a sterile room. "Sit," he commanded softly. He pointed toward a heavy velvet armchair in the corner, draped in a thick, hand-woven wool blanket of deep moss green. "The world isn't going to end if you stop moving for 10 minutes, I promise. In this room, the world has already slowed down to a manageable pace." Damaris sank into the chair, the fabric swallowing her. As she sat, she realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that she had forgotten how to exist in a room where no one was shouting. There were no alarms, no paging systems, no frantic requests for a crash cart. The silence between the ticks was not an empty space to be filled with anxiety, it was a cushion. She felt a strange, floating sensation, a vertigo of peace that made her feel as though she were drifting away from the shore. She found herself gripping the armrests, afraid that if she let go, she might simply dissolve into the amber light. Oisin moved away toward a small kitchenette at the back of the shop. His movements were slow and deliberate, the sound of a kettle being filled and the clink of porcelain jars echoing with a rhythmic precision. He didn't rush the process. He didn't try to optimize the efficiency of the tea-making. He simply performed the ritual, his presence a steady beat that complemented the ticking of the clocks. While he was gone, Damaris let her gaze wander to the far corner of the shop, where a towering grandfather clock stood in a pool of dim light. It was a masterpiece of dark walnut, its face an intricate map of gold leaf and Roman numerals. But as she studied the pendulum, she frowned. The heavy brass disc was motionless, frozen at a sharp angle, as if it had been stopped mid-swing by an invisible hand. And yet, as the minute hand crept forward with an agonizing slowness, the clock let out a deep, resonant chime. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a ghost tone emanating from a dead mechanism. The chime was rich and mournful, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes. It wasn't the sound of a clock keeping time. It was the sound of time remembering itself. Damaris stared at the frozen pendulum, a cold prickle of curiosity cutting through her lethargy. Just as she shifted her weight to stand and examine the piece, Oisin returned, 2 steaming mugs of tea in his hands. He stopped short, noticing where she was looking. He didn't move to fix the clock, nor did he explain it. He simply placed the tea on the side table and looked at the frozen pendulum with a gaze of quiet reverence. "Some things," Oisin said, his voice a low hum, "don't need to move to be heard. You've spent a long time rushing to keep up with a clock that never stops, Damaris. Maybe it's time you learned how to listen to the one that does." He handed her the mug, and as their fingers brushed, Damaris felt a spark of genuine warmth. But as she took a sip of the tea, her eyes remained fixed on the motionless pendulum, wondering why a broken heart of brass could still sing so clearly in the silence. Ribbons of steam. The chamomile tea arrived in heavy, cream-colored ceramic mugs that felt warm and grounding in Damaris's palms. Above the rims, the steam didn't just rise. It curled in slow, hypnotic ribbons, twisting into pale spirals that seemed to mirror the intricate gears of the clocks surrounding them. The scent was thick and herbal, a fragrant blanket that filled the gap between her and Oisin, softening the edges of the room. Damaris took a sip, the heat blooming in her chest, but the sudden stillness of the shop felt like a vacuum, and her mind, still wired for the high-voltage urgency of the surgical ward, rushed to fill it. It was just relentless, Damaris said, the words spilling out with a speed that felt violent in the quiet air. The alarms in the ICU don't stop. You learn to categorize the sounds, the ventilator's hiss, the drip of the infusion pump, the pitch of a crashing patient, but after 10 hours, it all just becomes one long, piercing scream. I spent 3 years feeling like I was sprinting through a tunnel with no exit, and even now, sitting here, I can still hear the phantom ringing of the call buttons in the back of my skull. She spoke faster as she went, her voice gaining a frantic edge, her hands tightening around the mug until her knuckles turned a brittle white. Oisin didn't interrupt. He didn't offer a platitude or a hurried reassurance. He simply sat back in his wooden chair, his gaze steady and patient. He blinked slowly, a deliberate movement that seemed to pace the conversation, forcing a gap between her sentences. When she finally ran out of breath and trailed off, he let the silence hang for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the collective rhythmic heartbeat of 100 clocks, a symphony of ticking that usually would have grated on her nerves, but here, under Oisin's gaze, it felt like a metronome guiding her back to a resting heart rate. "You're still sprinting, Damaris," Oisin said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Even now, you're trying to outrun the silence. But silence isn't a void you have to fill. It's a place to sit." Damaris opened her mouth to argue, to explain that in her world, silence usually meant a heart had stopped. But she caught the way he was looking at her. There was no judgment, only a profound, quiet invitation. She felt a sudden, sharp urge to speak again, to justify her agitation, to explain the mechanics of burnout. Instead, she consciously pressed her lips together. She focused on the steam of the tea, watching a single ribbon of vapor drift toward the ceiling. She forced herself to let the silence linger, feeling the tension in the air stretch like a piece of worn taffy. For the first time in years, the absence of noise didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a permission slip. Oisin shifted his weight, his finger rhythmically tapping the wooden counter beside him, a soft, steady beat. "My grandfather, Jiro, used to say that we don't live in time, we live in the textures it leaves behind. He taught me that the shop isn't just a place of business, but a sanctuary for things that have been forgotten by the rush." He looked toward the frozen pendulum of the grandfather clock, his expression softening. "The burden of this place is that it demands a different kind of attention. You can't force a spring to set or a gear to align. If you rush a clock, you break the spirit of the movement. You have to treat time as a fabric, something you weave slowly, thread by thread, rather than a deadline you're constantly missing." Damaris watched him, noting the way his shoulders had dropped, the way he seemed to occupy the space without trying to dominate it. She realized that her internal monologue, which had been a jagged, overlapping scream of checklists and anxieties since she crossed the town line, had shifted. The volume had turned down. The scream had become a whisper, and the whisper was slowly fading into a hum. She leaned back into the plush fabric of the chair, feeling the weight of her own body sinking into the cushion. She became aware of her jaw. For years she had carried a permanent clench in her masseters, a physical manifestation of a decade spent bracing for the next crisis. She felt the muscle twitch, then, mimicking the slow, deep rhythm of Oisin's breathing, she consciously let it go. The release was visceral, a sudden slackening that made her feel momentarily lightheaded, as if a heavy mask had been lifted from her face. She took a deep, conscious exhale, her breath mingling with the chamomile steam. "Do you remember the summer we tried to build that raft out of old fence posts and twine?" Oisin asked, a small, crooked smile touching his lips. Damaris let out a short, surprised sound, a huff of air that evolved into a genuine laugh. It was a sound she hadn't heard herself make in months, a bright, clear note that cut through the somniferous atmosphere of the shop. "The one that sank exactly 3 inches from the shore?" "Precisely," Oisin chuckled, the sound low and warm. You spent an hour calculating the buoyancy using a textbook you'd stolen from the library, and I spent an hour tying knots I'd seen in the sailor's manual. We were so precise in our planning that we forgot to check if the wood was actually watertight. They sat in that shared memory for a moment, the warmth of the tea and the warmth of the recollection weaving together. Damaris felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name, not quite happiness, but a profound sense of safety. The shop, with its amber light and its singing, broken clocks, felt less like a store and more like a cocoon. She felt her guard dropping, the invisible armor she wore in the city finally beginning to flake away. Then the peace was shattered. From the apartment directly next door, a heavy rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't the sound of something falling. It was a deliberate mechanical percussion. A slow, booming thump-drag, that shook the tea in their mugs, sending small, concentric ripples dancing across the surface of the liquid. The sound was oppressive, possessing a weight that felt physical, as if something immense was being shifted across the floor above. Damaris stiffened, her jaw tightening instinctively as the crisis mode's reflex flickered back to life. She studied Oisin, expecting alarm or confusion, but he had stopped tapping the counter. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, his expression unreadable. The thumping continued, rhythmic and insistent, a jarring contrast to the delicate ticking of the clocks, sounding less like a neighbor and more like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been dead for a very long time. The woolen cocoon. The door didn't just open, it surrendered to a sudden humming momentum. Mishka Alzarani swept into the shop like a gust of wind that had spent the morning collecting laundry, draped in layers of oversized, hand-woven textiles that seemed to defy the laws of geometry. She carried with her a scent that hit Damaris like a physical wall, raw, lanolin-heavy wool, mixed with a sharp, medicinal spike of dried lavender and something that smelled like rain on hot stone. Mishka didn't stop to greet them or acknowledge the heavy, rhythmic thumping still vibrating through the floorboards from the apartment above. She simply hummed, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in the back of her throat, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Damaris with a terrifyingly precise intensity. "You're vibrating," Mishka declared, her voice possessing a warm, humming quality that made the words feel rounded, as if they had been polished. She didn't wait for a response. In one fluid motion, Mishka reached into the heap of fabric she wore and produced a heavy, cream-colored blanket. It wasn't a mere throw. It was a dense architectural piece of weaving, the edges fringed with thick, uneven knots. Before Damaris could shift her weight or offer a polite refusal, Mishka had stepped into her personal space and draped the fabric over her shoulders. The weight was immediate and staggering, a sudden plummet of pressure that pinned Damaris's arms to her sides. Damaris stiffened, her shoulders hiking up toward her ears. For a second, the instinct was not one of comfort, but of entrapment. In the surgical ward, weight meant a patient slipping off a gurney, or the oppressive pressure of a lead apron during an X-ray. To be wrapped in something she couldn't easily shed felt like a vulnerability, a loss of the perimeter she had spent years meticulously guarding. She shifted her feet, her mind already calculating the fastest way to shrug the wool off, without offending the woman, who looked as though she had been woven from the same yarn as her blankets. She felt the familiar flicker of the city mind, the need to be ready, the need to be agile, the need to be able to bolt from the room at the first sign of a crisis. Oisin watched the exchange with a quiet, knowing stillness, his finger continuing its rhythmic tap on the wooden counter, though the speed had slowed to match the heavy thumping from above. He didn't intervene. He simply adjusted his glasses with a single finger, his gaze drifting between the frantic tension in Damaris's jaw and the serene, humming competence of Mishka. The shop felt smaller now, the air thickened by the scent of lavender and the sudden presence of so much wool. The ticking of the clocks, once a cacophony, began to merge with Mishka's humming, creating a layered auditory blanket that seemed to dampen the sharp edges of the room. "Just stay," Mishka whispered, the sentence trailing off into a contented sigh. She didn't push, but she didn't move away either, her presence acting as a secondary anchor. Damaris tried to settle, but she found that the act of relaxing was not a passive slide into peace. It was a grueling, active effort. She realized, with a sudden jolt of frustration, that she was so depleted that the very concept of stillness felt like an insurmountable task. Her muscles were locked in a permanent state of high alert, a phantom siren still wailing in the back of her mind. She felt like a clock with a spring wound too tight, the gears grinding against one another because they had forgotten how to turn slowly. She stared at the cream-colored wool, the fibers coarse against her skin, and felt a strange, surging resentment toward the ease with which the others existed in this space. Seeing the struggle, Mishka reached out and gently took Damaris's hand, guiding her fingers into the thickest part of the weave. "Don't try to be still," Mishka murmured, her voice a soft vibration. "Just feel the grit. Knead the wool. Find the knots." Damaris hesitated, then allowed her fingers to sink into the fabric. She began to squeeze the wool, the tactile sensation grounding her in a way that the silence had not. She focused on the rough texture, the way some threads were thicker than others, the slight oiliness of the raw wool, the microscopic prickle of the fibers against her fingertips. She zoomed in on a single knot, a small, stubborn lump of yarn that resisted her pressure. She felt the tension of the thread, the way it had been pulled tight by a human hand, the physical evidence of a slow, deliberate process. The sensation was an anchor, dragging her out of the swirling static of her own thoughts and pinning her to the present moment. She wasn't a nurse in a collapsing ward or a stranger in a strange town. She was simply a person touching wool. As she continued to knead the fabric, the warmth of the cocoon began to seep through her clothes, triggering a heavy, honey-like sensation in her limbs. Her arms felt as though they were turning to stone, but it was a welcome weight, a gravitational pull that finally anchored her to the earth. The phantom siren in her head dimmed to a low hum, then faded entirely. For the first time since she had arrived in Marrow-on-the-Hill, the air didn't feel like something she had to fight through. It felt like something she could simply breathe. She felt her jaw unclench, the muscles finally surrendering as she leaned back into the support of the chair, the blanket enveloping her like a thick woolen shell. Oysen spoke then, his voice low and steady, a metronome for the quiet that had finally settled. "Mishka's blankets are the only things in this town that move slower than my clocks," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Damaris didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. She was drifting, the boundary between her own body and the cream-colored fabric blurring. The rhythmic thumping from the apartment above had not stopped, but it had changed in her perception. It no longer sounded like a threat, but like a distant drum, a heartbeat that belonged to the house itself. She felt a profound sense of safety, a cocooned isolation that made the rest of the world feel irrelevant. She closed her eyes, listening to the symphony of ticking and humming, feeling the heaviness of the wool holding her down, preventing her from floating away into the void of her own exhaustion. Just as she felt herself on the precipice of a deep, dreamless sleep, Mishka leaned in. The scent of lavender intensified, and the humming stopped abruptly, leaving a sudden, expectant silence. "These blankets are woven with a rhythm, Damaris," Mishka whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock. Ancient cadence meant to pull the spirit back into the bone. But this one, she paused, her hand lightly brushing the edge of the cream-colored fabric. "This pattern is missing its final thread. It's an unfinished piece." Damaris opened her eyes, the warmth of the wool suddenly feeling less like a shelter and more like a question. She looked up at the ceiling, where the thumping had ceased, replaced by a silence that felt heavy and intentional. The piece was there, but it was fragile, a thin veil stretched over something unresolved. She studied Oysen, but he was staring at the frozen pendulum of the grandfather clock, his expression unreadable, as if he were listening for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. The philosophy of drift. "Look at the gear, not the hand," Jiro whispered, his hand sweeping through the air in a slow, undulating arc that seemed to push the very oxygen of the room aside. Damaris blinked, her gaze snapping from the frozen pendulum of the grandfather clock to the small, open-faced mechanism Jiro held in his palm. It was a brass assembly, no larger than a pocket watch, its teeth interlocking with a precision that felt aggressive in its perfection. She had been hovering in that strange, liminal space, half wrapped in Mishka's unfinished blanket, half tethered to the unsettling silence of the apartment above, when Jiro had appeared from the back room. He didn't walk so much as drift, a ghost in a linen smock that smelled of cedar shavings and old paper. "The movement is too slow," Damaris said, her voice sounding thin and frantic to her own ears. She didn't realize she was leaning forward, her muscles tightening as if she were standing over an operating table, anticipating a bleed. "If the gear slips by even a fraction of a millimeter, the whole sequence lags. It's inefficient. You could tighten the spring, increase the tension, and get a more consistent rotation." Jiro didn't look up. He simply tilted the brass piece so the light from the dusty window caught the gold of the wheels. Efficiency is a city virtue, Damaris. It is the art of arriving at the end as quickly as possible. But why would anyone wish to reach the end of a moment so soon? His voice was a thin, comforting whisper, like the sound of a page turning in a library where no one had spoken for a century. He shifted the gear slightly, and the movement was almost imperceptible, a glacial crawl that defied the urgency humming in Damaris's veins. I just mean, it feels like it's wasting time, she replied. She felt a familiar itch in her palms, the phantom need to check a monitor, to chart a patient, to optimize a workflow. In the hospital, a lag in movement was a failure of system. Here, it felt like an invitation to anxiety. She shifted under the wool of the blanket, the missing final thread now feeling like a physical gap in her own composure. Jiro let out a soft, wheezing laugh that vibrated in his chest. He closed his eyes, his head tilting back as if he were listening to a frequency only he could perceive. "You are listening to the tick," he said. "Everyone listens to the tick. The tick is the event. The tick is the work. But the most beautiful part of a clock, the only part that truly matters, is the gap between the ticks." Damaris froze. She tried to find the gap, but her mind instinctively filled the void with calculations. She began to mentally map the oscillation, the physics of the swing, the mechanical necessity of the pause. She was trying to solve the silence as if it were a puzzle with a correct answer. "Describe the silence for me," Jiro requested, his eyes still closed. "Not the quiet, not the absence of the city. Describe the silence between those two beats." Damaris opened her mouth, but no words came. She realized with a sudden, jolting clarity that she couldn't. For 15 years, she had lived in a world where quiet was merely a temporary ceasefire between alarms, a brief window to breathe before the next crisis erupted. She had known the absence of noise, yes, the sterile, dead air of a recovery room at 4000 a.m., but she had never known silence as a substance. To her, silence was a vacuum, a hole where information should be. It was a lack, not a presence. She sank back into the chair, her shoulders dropping an inch. The realization left her feeling momentarily hollowed out, as if Jiro had reached into her chest and gently removed a clockwork heart she hadn't known she was carrying. She studied her hands. They were shaking, just a tremor, the residual vibration of a life spent in high-velocity motion. Oysen, who had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, moved then. He didn't speak, but his movements were deliberate. He stepped toward the far wall where a heavy, dust-laden velvet curtain of deep crimson had spent decades obscuring a set of tall, narrow windows. With a single fluid motion, he gripped the fabric and hauled it back. The transformation was instantaneous. The shop, which had felt like a dim museum of frozen time, was suddenly flooded with a soft amber light that tasted of salt and old wood. The dust motes danced in the beams, swirling in slow, lazy spirals that mirrored Jiro's hand movements. The room shifted from a place of storage to a sanctuary, the light softening the hard edges of the brass and mahogany. Oysen adjusted his glasses with a single finger, his gaze lingering on Damaris. He didn't offer a platitude, he simply gave her the light. Damaris watched a single mote of dust descend. She tried to mimic Jiro's drift. She began to move her hand through the air, not to reach for anything, but simply to feel the resistance of the atmosphere. She imagined her thoughts were like the dust, not things to be captured or filed away, but things to be watched as they fell. The conceptual need for productivity, that screaming inner voice that demanded she be doing something useful, began to dissolve into the amber light. She felt a strange, heavy warmth spreading from her toes upward, a gravitational peace that made the idea of a schedule seem absurd, a childish game played by people who didn't know how to breathe. She closed her eyes and tried to find the gap again. This time she didn't calculate. She just waited. She felt the thumping from the apartment above, that rhythmic thud-drag sound, and instead of bracing against it, she let it become part of the cadence. The house was breathing. The clocks were breathing. She was breathing. "There," Jiro whispered, his voice sounding closer now. "You've stopped fighting the air." Damaris let out a long, conscious exhale, her body finally merging with the cream-colored wool of the blanket. The tension in her jaw vanished. For a moment, the world was nothing but the scent of beeswax and the slow, golden drift of the afternoon. She felt as though she were floating in a warm current, the shore of her old life receding until it was nothing more than a gray smudge on the horizon. Then the atmosphere shifted. The warmth didn't vanish, but it curdled. Jiro's voice had lost its airy quality. His hand, which had been sweeping in circles, suddenly stopped, pointing toward the far corner of the room. His expression had turned solemn, his brow furrowing in a way that made him look suddenly very old and very tired. Damaris followed his finger. There, perched on a small mahogany plinth, was a slender, silver-cased clock. It was an elegant piece, minimalist and cold. But as she watched, the second hand didn't jump forward. It shuddered, paused, and then snapped backward with a sharp, metal-sharp click. Then again. And again. It was ticking backward, carving a path into the past with a rhythmic, insistent violence that shattered the stillness of the room. The sound wasn't a tick. It was a countdown in reverse, and in the sudden silence that followed, the thumping from the apartment above started again, louder this time, as if responding to the clock's regression. The ink's steady pulse. The scratch of the nib against heavy vellum was the only sound cutting through the silence, a rhythmic, abrasive pulse. Vanya sat at the small oak desk, her spine a perfect vertical line, her wrist anchored to the wood. She didn't look up as Damaris approached, but the air around her had changed. The sharp, static chill that usually accompanied Vanya's presence had softened into the scent of old paper and dried lavender. There was a precision to her movements, the ink pooling in a glossy obsidian bead before being dragged across the page in a sweeping, deliberate curve. Damaris stopped a few feet away, her breath slowing to match the cadence of the pen. For months, she had viewed Vanya as a sentinel of judgment, a woman whose rigidity was a weapon used to prune anyone who didn't fit the town's silent musk. But seeing her now, the way her fingers gripped the pen with devotional grace, Damaris felt a pull of curiosity. She didn't want to break the silence, but she wanted to be part of the rhythm. "The ink is iron gall," Vanya said, her voice crisp but lacking its usual edge. She finally looked up, her eyes scanning Damaris with a clinical neutrality that felt, for the first time, like an invitation. "It bites into the paper, it becomes part of the grain. If you rush the stroke, the ink splatters. If you hesitate, it pools. It demands a singular, unwavering presence." Vanya slid a second sheet of parchment and a spare pen toward the edge of the desk. In the stillness of Oisin's shop, the gesture felt like a bridge being lowered. "Try it," Vanya commanded softly. "Do not think of the letter. Think only of the friction between the metal and the page. The order of the stroke is not a cage, Damaris. It is the only thing that keeps the hand from shaking." Damaris sat on the edge of the wooden stool and took the pen. As she dipped the nib, a single drop fell, staining the mahogany desk with a dark blot. She braced for a sharp remark about disorder, but Vanya only watched, her expression unreadable. Damaris pressed the nib to the parchment. The initial scratch was jarring, vibrating up her arm, but as she drew a long, descending line, the friction smoothed out. It was the same rhythmic focus she had used in the operating theater to steady her hands during a hemorrhage, but here, there was no adrenaline, only the slow, deliberate migration of ink. They sat in silence for a long while, mirroring each other's movements. The dual scratching of the pens blended with the distant, steady thrum of the grandfather clocks. Damaris noticed that Vanya's breathing had synchronized with her own. The rigidity she had perceived as arrogance now looked like armor. "I spent 20 years organizing the village archives," Vanya said softly, her gaze remaining on her work. "Every ledger, every birth record, every map. I believed that if I could categorize every second of our history, I could prevent the present from slipping away. I thought that if I were rigid enough, the world would stop tilting." She paused, the pen hovering. "My internal world is a riot of noise, Damaris. The order is not for the town. It is so that I do not drown in the chaos of my own mind." Damaris felt a sharp kinship. She thought of her years in the city, clinging to checklists and protocols to survive the carnage of the ICU, treating her life as a series of boxes to avoid the weight of the grief she witnessed. They were both architects of their own discipline, building walls of routine to keep the tide at bay. The air between them cleared, the remaining friction melting into a shared harmony. From the back of the shop, the chime of a clock signaled the hour, a deep, resonant chord that vibrated through the floorboards. Oisin stepped out from behind the velvet curtain of the restoration room, his glasses sliding down his nose. He studied the two women sitting side by side in a pool of golden afternoon light, their fingers stained with ink. "I've been thinking about the sign," Oisin said, his voice steady as a metronome. He leaned against the counter, his finger tapping the wood. "The shop has always been a place where things are fixed, where time is corrected, but we've spent too much time trying to make the clocks perfect, and not enough time letting them be slow." He looked around at the ticking pendulums and the scent of beeswax. "I'm changing the name. It is no longer just a repair shop. This is a sanctuary of slow time, a place where people can come to stop fighting the air. Damaris saw a man who had finally stopped trying to engineer his way out of his own life. The tension that had defined the shop, the conflict between duty and peace, resolved in that single sentence. The sanctuary wasn't a destination. It was the act of sitting in the silence together. For the rest of the afternoon, the three of them existed in a meditative state. Hoisin brewed chamomile and valerian tea, the steam curling in lazy spirals. Damaris returned to her calligraphy, the repetitive motion acting as a balm for her restlessness. The shared silence was thick and warm, muffling the outside world. The judgment of the locals and the ghosts of the city felt miles away, separated by the heavy oak door and the rhythmic pulse of the clocks. As the light faded into a bruised purple, casting long shadows across the floor, Vanya paused mid-stroke. Her pen stopped dead. Damaris, noticing the stillness, leaned over to look at Vanya's page. Vanya's eyes were wide, her breath catching in her throat. On the cream-colored vellum, a large, accidental smudge of ink had bloomed where her palm had pressed too hard. It wasn't a random blot. The ink had spread into a jagged, precise shape, a series of interlocking triangles and a sharp, descending line. It was a symbol, an exact replica of the warning glyph found in the restricted sections of the village archives, the one marking the areas of the coast where the tide didn't just rise, but vanished entirely. Vanya didn't move. She didn't wipe it away. She simply stared at the mark, her face turning a ghostly shade of pale, as if the ink had just whispered a secret she had spent 20 years trying to bury. The rain's soft barrier. The first drop hit the windowpane like a snapped guitar string. Then came the rest, a sudden, violent deluge that turned the world outside the sanctuary of slow time into a wall of opaque charcoal gray. The rain didn't fall so much as attack, blurring the cobblestones of Marrow-on-the-Hill into a smear of wet slate. Inside, the air remained thick with beeswax and chamomile, but the shift in light cast the room into a premature, watery twilight. Damaris stood frozen by the workbench, her hand hovering over her calligraphy pen. The rhythmic drumming on the roof didn't feel like a cocoon, it felt like an intrusion. As the scent of damp wool and wet stone seeped through the door's weather stripping, the shop's fragrance vanished. In its place rose the sharp tang of static and wet pavement. She could almost see the strobe of blue and red lights reflecting off rain-slicked asphalt, the siren's wail cutting through the storm like a serrated blade. She could feel the grit of the street beneath her boots, and the crushing weight of a gurney that refused to glide. Her breath hitched. The walls of the sanctuary seemed to thin, becoming translucent. The ticking of the clocks, once a balm, now sounded like a countdown. Every click of a gear was a second lost in a trauma bay. Every chime was a monitor flatlining in a room that smelled of bleach and desperation. The burnout she had thought she was shedding wasn't a skin she had outgrown, but a permanent scar, a jagged line carved into her psyche. The cold coil of panic tightened in her gut, whispering that this piece was a fragile bubble waiting to be popped. She retreated until her back hit the rough-hewn timber of the far corner. Sliding down the wall, she pulled her knees to her chest, her breathing shallow and erratic. The world narrowed to the space between her ribs and the frantic pulse in her neck. She tried the rhythmic breathing Oisin had mentioned, but the air felt too thick to swallow, as if the rain had flooded the room. She closed her eyes, but the darkness only amplified the ghosts of patients whose names she had forgotten, but whose fear she still carried in her marrow. The wool remembers the sheep, and the sheep remembers the meadow, a voice hummed. Damaris felt a presence beside her, a radiating warmth smelling of dried lavender and raw lanolin. Without a word, a heavy indigo wool shawl was draped over her shoulders. The weight was immediate and profound, a physical anchor pressing her back into the reality of the floorboards. Mishka didn't offer a hollow platitude. She simply knelt, her hand kneading the fabric in a slow, rhythmic motion that mirrored a heartbeat. Damaris opened her eyes. Mishka watched her with quiet, patient observation. Damaris gripped the edges of the shawl, the coarse texture of the hand-spun yarn scratching her palms. She focused on that friction, the tactile truth of the wool, to pull herself out of the memory of the ambulance. The shawl acted as a grounding wire, draining the electric current of the panic attack. Slowly, Damaris shifted her gaze. Across the room, the grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels. She picked a towering mahogany piece with a brass pendulum swinging with hypnotic grace. Each swing was a promise, the world was still turning, and for the first time in years, she wasn't the one responsible for stopping the clock. As her heart slowed, the rain shifted from an attack to a barrier. The storm had erased the road to the city, sealing the shop off from the world. The gray wall outside wasn't a prison, but a liquid curtain protecting this sanctuary of beeswax and ticking gears from the frantic energy beyond. The isolation felt intentional, a forced pause demanding she look inward. She leaned her head against the timber, the indigo wool wrapping her in a physical embrace. Vanya, who had been frozen since the ink had bloomed into the warning glyph on her vellum, finally moved. Her rigid posture softened as she studied the smudge on the paper, then the rain, and finally Damaris. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a mirrored apprehension, as if she too were listening to something hidden beneath the storm. The tension in the room had shifted from the friction of city versus village to a shared heavy stillness. Oisin emerged from the back room with a tray of tea smelling of ginger and honey. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply set the tea on a low table and adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on the window. His metronomic presence acted as a final anchor, stitching the fragments of the moment together. "The rain in Marrow is different from the rain elsewhere," Oisin said, his voice low. "It doesn't just wash things away. It brings things to the surface. It forces the hidden things to breathe." Damaris reached from beneath the shawl for a cup of tea, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into her chilled skin. A fragile peace settled over her. She felt as though she had survived a small death and been reborn. The burnout was still there, a dull ache, but it no longer felt like a predator. It felt like a piece of luggage she had finally decided to set down. Then, through the muffled roar of the downpour, a sound emerged. It was a knock on the heavy oak door. It wasn't the frantic rapping of someone seeking shelter, nor a neighbor's casual greeting. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sequence. 3 slow beats, a long pause, and 3 more. It was too slow to be human, too steady to be the wind, and too precise to be an accident. Damaris froze, the tea steaming in her hand. The sound echoed through the shop, cutting through the ticking of the clocks with a cold, mechanical certainty. Oisin and Vanya exchanged a look of sharp alarm. The knocking continued with an unwavering cadence, as if something on the other side of the door was counting the seconds, waiting for them to let the storm inside. The rhythmic sync. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a void heavier than the sound itself. Damaris remained suspended in the brittle moment, the ceramic cup warm against her palms, steam curling in a lazy spiral. Vanya's hand was clamped over the vellum, her knuckles white, her eyes calculating the thickness of the heavy oak door. Oisin shifted his weight, his finger tapping a nervous staccato against the mahogany counter, a sharp contrast to the rhythmic pulse of the grandfather clocks lining the walls. The silence was a living thing, thick with the smell of static and old oil, pressing against the windows like the cobalt fog outside. "It is the tide," Vanya said, her voice a crisp blade. She began smoothing an imaginary crease in her apron with mechanical precision. "The water rises in the hollows of Marrow, bringing echoes of things that forgot how to leave. We do not answer the door when the rhythm is too steady. We wait for the drift to carry it away." Damaris felt the phantom vibration of a pager against her hip, a reflex from 1,000 shifts where a rhythmic sound meant a code blue. Her breathing was shallow, a jagged pattern clashing with the room. City-bred agitation clawed at her throat, the instinct to triage to solve the mystery of the knock. But Oisin was leaning into the sound of the shop, his shoulders dropping, his eyes closing. He wasn't fighting the silence, he was merging with it. "Sit," Oisin commanded softly, gesturing toward the center of the room. He sounded like a technician guiding a delicate piece of machinery into place. "You are still vibrating, Damaris." A tuning fork struck by a hammer. "If you stay in that frequency, the noise of the world will always find you. Come away from the door, sit in the center of the ticking." Damaris obeyed, sinking into a wide, velvet armchair that smelled of cedar and old dust. She closed her eyes, but the darkness was crowded. Mental checklists flickered like a broken neon sign. Check the vitals. Monitor the drip. Update the chart. The frantic energy of the Metropolitan Hospital was a humming wire in her skull, a high-frequency scream drowning out the cadence of Oakhaven. Her heartbeat was a panicked bird trapped in her ribs. Then she focused on the low-frequency hum of the grandfather clocks, a subterranean thrum originating from the floorboards. She began the rhythmic sync. She didn't force her breath, instead she listened for the heaviest pendulum in the room, the one moving with the inevitable gravity of a deep-sea current. Swoosh, dot, knee swoosh. Inhale. Tick. Exhale. At first, the alignment was clumsy. Her mind screamed that stillness was a waste of precious seconds. Why am I sitting here while something is at the door? I should be checking the perimeter. The internal monologue spiked, a frantic loop of anxiety. The city was a predator, and it had followed her to the coast, hiding in the gaps between the ticks. But she stayed. She leaned into the friction, letting the phantom alarms of the hospital clash against the steady beat of the clocks until the sounds blurred. She imagined the city's noise as sand being dropped into a deep, still lake. One by one, the grains sank. The urgency that had defined her for a decade, the pressure to be the first responder to every disaster, lost its grip. She wasn't a nurse here. She was simply a body in a chair, a vessel for the sound. Stop trying to find the peace. A whisper drifted beside her ear. Damaris didn't open her eyes. She felt the presence of Jiro Watanabe, his movements as weightless as a falling leaf. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his steady warmth. You are hunting for it like a prize, Jiro continued, his voice a papery rustle. You are treating stillness as a medication to be administered in a precise dose. But peace is not a destination, Damaris. It is the absence of resistance. Stop trying to find the peace, simply stop resisting the drift. Damaris let go. She stopped the conscious effort to sink and collapsed into the sound. The distinction between her breathing and the mechanical respiration of the clocks vanished. The sonic blanket of the shop filtered out the rain, the fog, and the memory of the knock. Her heartbeat slowed through natural surrender, merging with the collective pulse of the room, a deep throb echoing the tide against the cliffs. She reached a state of suspension where she could no longer tell where her skin ended and the velvet began. The air felt thick and warm, like clover honey, slowing her thoughts to a crawl. The crisis nurse identity, the woman who lived in the red zone of adrenaline, slipped away like a garment that no longer fit. She felt a profound, terrifying lightness, as if she were floating in a vat of warm oil. Then the peak arrived. It was a sudden, magnificent convergence. As if governed by a single conductor, every clock in the shop, the mahogany giants, the brass travel clocks, the intricate cuckoos struck the hour simultaneously. The sound was not a clash, but a chord. A resonant vibration that vibrated through her marrow, shaking the last remnants of the city from her bones. For a few seconds, the world was nothing but gold and bronze resonance, a physical weight anchoring her to the present moment with absolute certainty. As the echoes faded, leaving a ringing silence, Damaris opened her eyes. The room looked different, the light softer, the colors more saturated. Fanya was still by the door, but her posture had shifted from sentry to witness. Oisin watched Damaris with a small, knowing smile. Damaris tried to speak, but her voice was a soft, airy sound. She felt a lingering warmth in her chest, an equilibrium she hadn't known since childhood. But as she shifted her gaze toward the window, the peace flickered. On the glass, where the condensation had pooled, a single, clear handprint was pressed against the pane from the outside, too large to be human, and still dripping with the cobalt sludge of the tide. The golden hour's end. The cobalt sludge on the glass was still glistening, a visceral smudge of the outside world clinging to the boundary of the sanctuary, but Oisin didn't move toward the window. Instead, he stepped closer to Damaris, his presence a steady, grounding weight. He didn't ask her if she was afraid. He simply reached out and adjusted the drape of the heavy, cream-colored wool blanket that had begun to slip from her shoulders. The wool was coarse, but warm, smelling of dried lavender and the lanolin of sheep that had grazed on the salt-sprayed cliffs of the coast. Damaris looked from the handprint to Oisin, her breath coming in shallow, uneven hitches that felt like a foreign language, in a room that spoke only in steady rhythms. "Don't let the tide in," Damaris whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. The panic wasn't the sharp, jagged spike of the emergency room, the kind that demanded a crash cart and a loud voice, but a slow, creeping cold that started in her fingertips. She felt the phantom weight of her old scrubs, the memory of fluorescent lights that hummed with a predatory energy, threatening to pull her back into the red zone of adrenaline. She wanted to stand up, to scrub the glass clean, to lock the door and bolt the windows until the world was nothing but mahogany and brass, but her limbs felt as though they had been poured from heavy syrup. Oisin's finger tapped a rhythmic three-beat pattern on the wooden counter beside her, a sound like a heart beating in a dream. "The glass is thick, Damaris, and the shop knows how to keep its own time," he said, his voice low and resonant, a metronome for her drifting thoughts. He didn't look at the window. He studied her, his eyes steady behind his glasses. The things that knock are usually just looking for a way to stop. They see the stillness here, and they mistake it for an invitation. You aren't an invitation. You are a guest. From the corner of the room, Vanya moved. She didn't rush, she drifted with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic. She approached the window not with fear, but with a mild, professional distaste, as if the monstrous handprint were a misplaced comma in a ledger. She produced a small, dampened cloth from the pocket of her apron, smoothing the fabric against her thigh before she reached the glass. With one slow, deliberate motion, she wiped the cobalt sludge away. The movement was a correction, a restoration of order. She didn't shiver, and she didn't glance back at the fog. She simply straightened the curtain, ensuring the velvet fell in a perfect vertical line, and stepped back into the shadows of the room. Precision is the only defense against chaos, Vanya remarked, her voice crisp and melodic, though she didn't look at Damaris. The city teaches you to react to the chaos. Here, we simply remove it from the equation. Damaris sank deeper into the armchair, the wool blanket now cocooning her. The tension in her neck, a knot that had lived there for 7 years of 12-hour shifts, began to unravel. It happened slowly, a gradual loosening of the grip. She watched the way the light was changing. The sun was dipping below the crest of the hill, and the room was being flooded with a soft, honeyed gold. The light didn't just illuminate the shop, it seemed to saturate it, turning the brass gears of the open clocks into molten gold and the mahogany cases into deep, glowing amber. The shadows stretched across the floor in long, peaceful fingers, claiming the spaces between the ticking instruments. "I can't remember how to be this still," Damaris said, her eyes following a dust mote dancing in a shaft of gold. She felt a sudden, overwhelming drowsiness, a heaviness in her eyelids that felt like a homecoming. It wasn't the exhaustion of a double shift, the kind that left her shaking and hollow, but a rich, luxurious fatigue. It was the feeling of a long journey ending, of a heavy pack finally being slid off the shoulders. At that moment, the door to the side workshop creaked open, and Mishka entered. She carried a tray with 3 small ceramic cups, the scent of chamomile and steamed honey trailing after her like a veil. She was humming a low, wordless tune that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the clocks. As she approached, she paused, tilting her head to the side as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. She set the tea down on the low table with a soft clink and then moved to Damaris, her hands instinctively kneading the fabric of her own shawl. "You found the frequency," Mishka sighed, the sound a long, contented exhale. She reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Damaris's forehead. Her touch was light, smelling of essential oils and raw wool. "The first time the rhythm takes you, it feels like falling." "But you aren't falling, Damaris. You're just landing." Damaris took a sip of the tea. It was warm and thick, tasting of earth and sunlight. As the heat spread through her chest, she felt the last tether to her old life snap. It wasn't a violent break. There was no sound of tearing fabric or breaking glass. It was a gentle release, like a knot that had been soaked in water until it simply slid apart. The memory of the hospital, the beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic, the frantic pacing of the corridors, felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else in a different century. She tried to conjure the image of her old locker, the piles of charts, the cold coffee in a styrofoam cup, but the images were blurring, losing their edges in the golden light of the shop. Oysen and Vanya began a muted dance of closing. They moved in synchronicity, their motions fluid and devoid of urgency. Oysen dimmed the lamps one by one, the golden hue deepening into a warm, twilight bronze. Vanya drew the heavy velvet curtains shut, sealing the room away from the cobalt fog and the things that knocked. The sound of the curtain sliding shut was a finality, a soft thud that signaled the end of the day's vulnerabilities. The shop was now a sealed vessel, a sanctuary of ticking hearts and humming silence. Damaris felt her breathing shift. There was no longer a conscious effort to calm herself. It had become an effortless mirror of the clocks. In, out, tick, tock. The distinction between her own lungs and the mechanical respiration of the room vanished. She felt a profound, heavy drowsiness that pressed her down into the velvet of the chair, an invitation to surrender that she no longer had the strength or the desire to resist. Then came the final chime. It was the hour of total surrender. Every clock in the room, from the smallest travel piece to the towering mahogany giants, struck a single, resonant note. It wasn't a clash, but a soft, enveloping chord that vibrated through the marrow of her bones. The sound acted as a signal, a permission slip to let go of the last remaining fragment of vigilance. Damaris felt her chin dip toward her chest, her eyelids growing too heavy to hold open. She closed her eyes. The golden light of the room faded, replaced by a warm, velvet darkness that felt safe and absolute. There were no more questions about the tide, no more fear of the sludge on the glass, no more analysis of the silence. Her mind, which had been a storm of checklists and crisis management for a decade, finally went quiet. The noise stopped, the static cleared. Damaris drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, falling into the stillness as if it were a lake of warm oil, her breath slow and steady, perfectly in sync with the heartbeat of the house.